I have two aims for this module. The first, imagine with me you're walking past the High Integrity Systems Engineering Cafe. There it is. You look through the window and there you see Trevor Kletz, the father of software engineering, on the left, Professor McDermott, the creator of the concept of high integrity systems engineering, on the right, Nancy Leveson, the current software safety guru, and me. Well, you come in, and if you sit down, you'll hear us chatting about faults, errors, failures, hazards, loss, assurance, risk, integrity levels, reliability, availability, omission bias, random faults, systematic faults. And my hope is at the end of this module, you'll be able to join us in the conversation and use all of the terms and many more with confidence. The second aim can be defined by asking the question, why high integrity systems engineering at all? Well, the second aim. Before today, you may have believed that software engineering is mostly about making things work. But in my opinion, you don't get paid for making software work. You get paid for stopping it failing. My mission in this course is to help you see the world in a different way. A world where things will go wrong, where a bottle that is half full is also half empty. The only thing we will ever know for certain about any software that you have ever written or will ever write is that one day, I promise you, it'll break. I want us to move away from the natural, aggressive optimism, the can-do, will finish, it'll be fine mindset, towards a more realistic pessimism. Most software lives in a world where a crash is, well, just an inconvenience. But the moment your code touches anything where failure means lost time, lost money, lost reputation, lost capability, increased anxiety, increased stress, or even physical harm, then the rules of this game must change. I don't believe anyone will ever thank you for the line of code that didn't break. Let's use a little metaphor. Think of software development a bit like driving. There are drivers who assume that every light will stay green, every car will behave predictably, and every pedestrian will await their turn. Those are aggressive drivers. They're powered by optimism and they make assumptions. And alas, it's why accidents happen. Getting there on time at your convenience may have a price that you simply never intended or imagined paying, but you will. Then there are drivers who assume the opposite, that someone will change lanes without signalling, a child may run into the road, the car ahead may stop suddenly. These are defensive drivers. They are high integrity systems engineers. We are cautious, we're conservative, we're alert to every potential failure. High integrity systems engineering demands the same mindset. You don't assume the road is safe. You assume that the road will be dangerous, and you design your vehicle on your journey primarily so nobody gets hurt. So imagine this. Tonight, when you sleep, a line of code that you wrote a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago fails, because it will. A transaction cannot be completed. The critical data is never collected. Hang on. A child's infusion pump overdoses. A drone misidentifies a target. A train overshoots a red signal. You never intended harm. You never imagined that the context of that failure. You were simply delivering on time and within budget. But these intentions don't prevent significant consequences. High integrity engineering requires a different mindset, a different culture, a different approach, one where you assume your code will fail because it will, and it is your responsibility because it is. It's no one else's. and you've got to ensure that when it does, there is almost no loss. That shift from hoping things go right to planning that something will and has gone wrong sits at the heart of this discipline. And this matters to you today, every single day, because software is written by people no older, no more experienced than you. You might write code that decides who gets insured, who gets a loan, how a medicine pump adjusts its flow, and, as we move forwards, when a self-driving car should brake. The uncomfortable truth is most of those developers are just like you. They were trained to move fast, to be optimistic, and just ship it on time. In the next decade, especially in a code AI-assisted world where Copilot and ChatGPT write more and more and we write less and less, well, that world belongs to engineers who think pessimistically, who trust no one, who trust nothing, always need evidence, who understand that assurance is not a luxury but a responsibility. High integrity systems aren't about documentation. They're not about bureaucracy. They're about protecting everyone from the limits of your own capability. So we're going to start this journey into introductions and fundamentals by making sure that we have clear definitions and we understand the importance of loss. We're going to have a look at a word, dependability, and investigate its attributes. Then we're going to have a clear definition of causality. We're going to look at the journey from fault, error, failure, hazard, and we'll have a quick chat about risk. We're then going to have a look at different analysis models and approaches that are available to us as high integrity systems engineers. Well, loss. Human beings are not very good natural judges of risk. Biases like optimism bias, sunk cost fallacy, and normalization of deviations often lead teams to ignore the warning signs. These innate biases help explain why systems drift towards failure, even when people know better, and recognize these mental traps allow us to design processes that help us to compensate for them. So let's have a look at some of these. The availability heuristic. People judge the likelihood of an event based on how easy it is for them to imagine it. Decision makers rely upon recent experiences. If nothing bad's happened recently, risk feels distant and abstract or unlikely. Rare but catastrophic outcomes are simply discounted because they're not available. It's not happened before, so it's not going to happen now. Risk is underestimated before any conscious decision is ever made. We have an optimism bias. It's not going to happen to me because failures are not relevant. Individuals believe in their systems, they believe in their teams, they believe in the environment in which they're working. Others may fail, but we won't. The organization moves from underestimating risk to simply personally dismissing it. Overconfidence on resilience is one of the dangerous things that high integrity systems engineers themselves suffer from. Omission bias. People judge harmful actions as worse than harmful inactions. Strange but true. Even if the outcomes are identical. Taking decisive action, stopping a system, escalating an issue, often feels more dodgier than doing nothing. Inaction becomes morally and psychologically safer than intervention. Problems are allowed to persist because not acting actually sometimes feels safer than acting. We actually collectively have an aversion to loss. It's actually got a name. It's called the prospect theory. Losses are felt about twice as much as the equivalent gain. Stopping, redesigning, rolling back a system is framed as a loss. It's not framed as an improvement, it's framed as a negative. A loss of time, a loss of money, a loss of reputation. Preventing failure, preventing harm is abstract, it's not real. Current losses are immediate and concrete. Decisions become framed around avoiding immediate loss, not avoiding subsequent loss. Sunk cost fallacy. Continuing to invest in a failing idea and a failing system to justify your past investment is almost normal. Once losses have accumulated, walking away feels like admitting failure. Often, rather than changing direction, more resources are committed in an attempt to recover what's already been spent. A rational reassessment is replaced by a justification for past decisions. Diffusion of responsibility. You've experienced this. When responsibility is shared, individuals assume that someone else will act. The problem always falls between the cracks. As problems persist, responsibility becomes distributed across teams, across roles, and across hierarchies. Everyone noticed the issue, but no one owns the decision to stop or escalate. The system continues because it has no single actor who feels accountable for sorting it. Normalization of deviance. Repeated exposure to minor losses without immediate catastrophe leads to an acceptance of those failures. Small failures become routine. Each successful operation, despite the deviation, reinforces the belief that the system is, well, it's safe enough, we got away with it this time, so we're going to get away with it next time. Deviance becomes, well, a standard practice. What was once unacceptable becomes normal. Well, until a major failure occurs. Humans' perception of risk is first underestimated due to the availability and optimism bias. When early warning signs appear, omission bias makes us feel inactive. In fact, makes inaction safer than intervention. Loss aversion and sunk cost then lock decision makers into defending the past, not wanting to change. Responsibility diffuses across an organization. Responsibility diffuses over time. Repeated minor failures without immediate catastrophe becomes normal. And by the time failure is recognized, unsafe practice is no longer seen as a problem. It's just how it was. So, I want you to reflect upon the conversation we've had in the last 2 or 3 minutes. Have you experienced that within your own workplace? Have you yourself, can you identify with some of those beliefs? The first step is accepting that we are flawed. And then the second step is trying to find ways to mitigate that. So let's have a look at loss. Loss can take many forms. Some of it is incredibly obvious. The loss of life, the loss of damage, the damage to equipment, harm to the environment, financial impact, reputational harm. Different industries prioritize them in different ways, but any of these can be severe enough so we just cannot justify not undertaking analysis to consider them. Here are some slightly more subtler forms of loss. The loss of operational continuity. It's downtime. It's business disruption. Production lines shut down. Supply chains get interrupted. Loss of some significant or critical services, whether that's a power supply, a data center, or the availability of a resource. Then, of course, there's the loss of data. Corrupted safety logs due to software malfunctions, loss of monitoring data which will prevent us from undertaking some form of auditing, and obviously cybersecurity breaches, which then in turn will have safety critical consequences. Loss of financial stability and loss of reputation and public trust. Financial stability, well, the consequences would be litigation and legal penalties. Compensation costs, stock price may fall as a result of some incidents. Public backlash due to failures. Regulations suddenly become more significant and you become under more scrutiny. then there will be obvious brand damage which will affect customer confidence and the services which you're producing. You and loss. We've talked about the loss of human life. We've talked about the loss of property or equipment damage. We've talked about the loss of environmental integrity. We've talked about the loss of financial stability. We've talked about the loss of reputation and public trust. How about you and loss? Have you in your workplace, or you as your student experience, suffered some form of stress, anxiety, frustration, anger, an inability to achieve what you wanted to achieve due to the loss of some form of capability out of a system? Think about it. Write it down. I'd be very surprised if there is lots of blank papers. I want to introduce you to the word dependability. Dependability is an umbrella term that binds together all the desirable attributes of a system which we want to glue into a single place at a single time, so we're setting out to avoid loss. Reliability is simply not enough. A reliable system performs consistently without failure. True. However, just because the system is reliable doesn't mean it's safe from loss. If a system functions perfectly reliable, but does the wrong thing at the wrong time, it can still and will lead to loss conditions. So to avoid loss, if we accept that reliability is not enough, then systems must also be safe, secure, reliable, available, maintainable, and resilient. It is only when all of those are working together we will end up with a system that we can depend upon. What I'd like you to think about is any system that you have some knowledge of, a system that you've built, a system that you've used, and I want you to rank these attributes which make sense for your perception of that system. What matters the most in that context? The other thing I want you to think about is, can you see any trade-offs between the attributes of dependencies between these attributes of dependability? Can you see any conflict between a system being safe, or a system being secure, or a system being available and a system being safe, or a system being reliable and a system being resilient? Write them down, think about it, and when we're together we'll share. So we've set the big scene. We've talked about loss and we've talked about dependability. Let's go into some detail now. In this section we're going to introduce a central causal chain of high integrity systems failure. That is fault, error, failure, hazard, loss. We'll walk through each step, showing how each originates internally or externally, and eventually becomes an external, harmful, if not controlled event. So let's start at the bottom. Let's start at the beginning. What is a fault? A fault is the root cause of an error. It might be a design flaw, an incorrect assumption, or a physical defect. Different disciplines, as you can see, define faults in slightly different ways. But they all agree, well, except Nancy Leveson and Eric, as we'll see later, the faults are the sources from which failure emerges. We can classify faults by their origin. They can either be random or systematic, by their behavior, by their latency, whether they're intermittent or transient, and by their impact and their detectability, or I prefer to use the word operability. These classifications will help us decide how to mitigate or how to prevent them. Let's have a look at random versus systematic faults. Random faults are features of hardware or physical devices. They're when components can unpredictably degrade. In contrast, systematic faults are manifest in software, where errors arise from design decisions. They will arise from design decisions and will reoccur every time the re-triggering condition is met. Understanding this distinction is essential for choosing the right assurance techniques. So it's really important that you understand the difference between what a random fault is, what a systematic fault is, and how it relates to software. So, software doesn't fail randomly. It doesn't get rusty. All of the faults are deterministic and systemic, and they're put in place by you. And because of that, reliability models don't work for software in the way that they do for hardware. Instead, we rely on another process. We rely on the process of assurance, on verification and validation, on configuration control, on independence to reduce the chance of faults escaping into the system. So, now we know what a fault is, let's make sure we know what an error is. A fault only becomes visible when it is manifested as an error. An error is an incorrect internal state. The thing is that not all faults lead to errors immediately. Many remain latent until a specific set of conditions which have activated it can be met. As you can see, it all depends upon who you ask what an error is. But for me, an error is when an internal deviation from an expected state occurs. They can be analysed and understood by considering their activation, their persistence, their location, their behaviour, their operability, which is the visibility and controllability of them, and their propagation. The system still might recover, or the error may propagate outwards, and one day it may propagate to becoming a failure. An error is simply a symptom of a fault. It's a warning where intervention is necessary and is still possible. So we know what a fault is, we know what an error is, let's make sure we know what is failure. Failure is when the system's incorrect state becomes externally observable. So it's a level of abstraction difference from a fault. The system can no longer provide its required function or service. Failures are what operators see, but not all failures will have equal significance. And again, what is failure? Well, it depends upon you who you ask. And there I have 4 clearly different definitions from 4 different organisations. So, what's a hazard? We know what a fault is, we know what an error is, we know what failure is. What's a hazard? Well, again, it depends upon who you ask. And here I'm going to provide 5 different definitions. If a failure is an externally observable deviation from the system's required service or the system's required function, it's typically caused by a fault that became an error and has manifested itself. A system hazard is a state which is caused by that failure, and it is a system state that could lead to an accident. Hazards don't guarantee loss, but they create the conditions under which accidents can occur if they're not controlled. So faults lead to errors, errors lead to failures, failures lead to hazards, and hazards, if they're not controlled, will lead to loss. This example walks through a whole chain. It's simple, but I think it's relatively clear. A software omission causes an error. The pressure valve fails to open. Overpressure becomes a hazard. and the vessel ruptures, causing loss. It shows how small faults can escalate through the system if not mitigated. But warning, this is far too simple model. We need a more sophisticated model. Here's another example. It's an aircraft example. It's quite recent. In this example, it shows how a slightly more complex scenario, a bird strike, fuel contamination, flight control faults, human factors, can all interact logically to create catastrophic failure. It illustrates why we often need structured models to help us understand. So, why did the aircraft crash into the college? Well, they had to be a loss of thrust, and they had to be a particular system state during takeoff. The loss of thrust, what could have caused that to happen? Well, it could have been a bird strike or simply no fuel to the engines. How come we ended up with no fuel to the engines? Well, we could have contamination, it could be empty, or we have a supply fault. What could have caused the supply fault? Well, physical fault, flight control system fault, or a human factor. Modelling these causal chains can become complex. So we've analysed faults and failures because understanding their pathways allows us to prevent accidents instead of reacting to them. Let's start with faults. Preventing faults it makes us try not to put them in the first place. Detecting assumes that they exist and lets us find out where they are and helps us remove them. Fault tolerance, it assumes that they exist and that they were never removed, and so we need to design to tolerate them. During runtime, faults will create errors. It's not if, it's when. So we have to ensure that we can detect them. Let's design error and recovery and resilience and redundancy and masking into our systems. And when our systems fail, and they will, we've got to make sure that we know what the safe state is for our system to fail into or degrade towards. And how can we isolate and contain that failure to prevent it becoming a hazard? And when we're unable to do that, how did we identify the potential hazards? How did we analyze and understand those risks? And did we use the right tools in the right way to ensure we were building it to the right safety integrity level? Without structured analysis, the risks will remain hidden and they'll remain undiscovered until we find out the hard way. One issue I want to resolve right now at the beginning of this course is the assumption that there's a simple failure model, the ones I've shown you earlier. There are a number of different perceptions and how systems can create loss that have changed over time and with experience. The domino model was one of the earliest linear causation models. Each unsafe act or condition triggers the next. It's simple, it's intuitively, but it doesn't capture the complexity of modern technical or socio-technical systems. There are two available mechanisms available for us to reason, and they're different perspectives. There is a deductive reasoning approach and there is an inductive reasoning approach. And our analysis of the failure can be either. It can be deductive, starting from a top level hazard and working downwards, and you will be introduced to fault tree analysis, or it can be inductive, where we're building up from a component level deviations, such as failure modes and effects analysis, and you'll be introduced to that as well. And the key here is it is not one, both are complementary and should be applied on the same systems. Bow tie modelling is a slightly different way of viewing the world. The bow tie model centres not at the start or at the top or the bottom, it starts in the middle. It starts on something called a deviation event, potentially a hazard or potentially an error. It identifies preventative barriers on the left and mitigation barriers on the right. It's widely used because it provides a clear visual analytical structure for managing issues which will become hazards. You will learn on this course how to apply HAZOPS, which is a technique that uses bow tie approach. More realistically, but slightly more complex, is the very, well understood, I think now, the Swiss cheese model, which shows that no single defense layer is perfect. Accidents occur with when multiple weaknesses align. It emphasizes latent conditions. It emphasizes organizational factors must align. It emphasizes that failure, organizational issues, human error, single points of failure on their own are not significant. It's the combination, the collection, the alignment which is the problem and which we must defend against. Slightly more recently, Nancy Leveson, who was in the cafe sipping a cappuccino probably with us, she defined this thing called STAMP, which we will talk about much later on in the course. It's systems theory, accident modeling and processing. So STAMP refrains safety as a control problem rather than a failure problem. We're moving away from the idea that things fail towards things are not controlled. Nancy suggests that accidents result from inadequate enforcement of constraints. And this model is well suited for complex software-intensive systems. You will learn how to apply a technique called STPA that's based upon this view of the world. The youngest and the subtlest of the behavioural modelling approaches is functional resonance analysis modelling. FRAM focuses on variability rather than failure. It assumes that small performance variations can combine in unexpected ways to create unanticipated and unrequired outputs to create accidents. FRAM is ideal for complex, adaptive, human technical systems where linear models fall short. Obviously, you'll be studying this on the course. Beware of the black swan. A black swan is a high impact, apparently impossible event that is not anticipated by existing analysis or risk models. We do HAZOPS, we do FTA, we do FMEA, we do FRAM, we do STPA. We never saw it coming, but which in hindsight is retrospectively obvious and rationalized. These are unknown unknowns. These are unknowns which describe what we do not know, what we don't know. The only thing that we will ever know is that our system will fail. Understanding loss, avoiding it through dependable systems, understanding the attributes of those systems, tracing the fault to loss journey, applying appropriate analysis models is the journey that we're about to undertake. And together they're going to provide the foundations for working confidently in high integrity systems engineering. Well, welcome to the High Integrity Systems Cafe. Look, it's so full of people now, they're just having to sit on the streets outside. And at the end of this course, you'll have the vocabulary and the concepts that you need to join the ongoing professional conversation in this cafe. You will be equipped to discuss faults, failures, hazards, and a range of analytical approaches and solutions with confidence. Come in. Mine's a flat white.